So, thank you, JNU Academic, right, for inviting me. I'm carrying the book around with me to convince people that I've read it. I have read it. How well is another matter we'll discover now. But let me begin by saying something. I mean, how delighted I am to always talk to so many people in a packed room like this. We haven't done this for a long time, right, Postal? So I think this calls for some small celebration, which I think Tea and Snacks will take care of that. Anupama, thank you for writing the book. As Gautam said a little while ago, I think the writing of a book does call for some degree of celebration or marking, not celebration as in, not looking at it critically. The reason why I'm saying this is because we are an academic community under attack. And we are an academic community under attack precisely because we have insisted that the reading, writing, and the arguing about books is very important in these Philistine anti-intellectual times that we live in. So I think this is a kind of a spirit of defiance which must be celebrated. Let me also add with some sadness that the academic atmosphere that the Americans have spawned, I love the Americans, don't I? I mean, it's very obvious in class. The publish or perish culture that's been spawned by American academia has created this inane churning out of books, which many of us have to write. Well, this book doesn't come under that. But the Arab philosopher of the 14th century, Ibn Khaldun, famously said that kitabon ka kasir, aksariyat, too many books is also a sign of a lack of wisdom. We don't have that in CPS. But let me begin with the book. Let me begin with talking about the book. Of course, let me begin with that cliche of the last speaker complaining that everyone said everything relevant and I have nothing left to say. Especially some of the points that Gautam made were very insightful. I can't make those points, I'm not a lawyer. So I will stay away from the legal part of it. How I read this book was there are 4 points that I'm juggling in my head and I hope I can kind of put those points forward. My first point is in terms of what I can only call a tragedy of citizenship in the last 30, 40 years, where increasingly the concept of citizenship has become narrowed and narrowed and narrowed down further to the point that it's becoming almost eviscerated. I mean, the meaningfulness of it is being evacuated and kind of sucked out of it. I mean, the point that Gautam made quoting Hannah Arendt about the right to have rights. I mean, what citizenship does to you is that it opens out access to a panoply of rights, which is very significant. Now, that is being denied to people at the drop of a hat, which is a very serious commentary on the kind of political situation that we are in right now. So I would want to begin with that particular point about how this is happening, this continuous narrowing out and evisceration and sucking out of what is significant and valuable in a concept like citizenship. It's being flattened out completely. I read Anupama's book in this kind of a larger background. So I'll just go back a little. I mean, sure, many of my MA students, when I taught key concepts, one will be familiar. So, repetitious as I am, please bear with me on this one. But what has been happening to citizenship? Go back to people like T.H. Marshall, for example. And they would very confidently talk about this kind of a slow, gradual extension of civil rights followed by political rights and social rights. Actually, we've had the exact opposite of that. I mean, since the late 20th century, we've had the reversal of the social rights of the welfare state. Then, we've had vast and many examples of disenfranchisement of populations. I mean, through things like, what is called gerrymandering. People are disenfranchised. Now what we have is a situation of something as fundamental as habeas corpus being denied to people. And there have been many petitions that the Supreme Court has been delaying, and we all know very famously the cliche is justice denied. Delayed is justice denied. So my point really is that this is a matter of great concern, which is why a book on citizenship must be written. The fact that a nation state can become so powerful that it can actually deprive an individual of his citizenship claims at the drop of a hat. Anupama, at the end of a book, in the conclusion, quotes from the British Pakistani novelist Kamila Shamsi, a book that I've read, and I read it in 4 hours flat. I was so kind of interested by the book, where she's very prescient. Because when she wrote the book in late 2017, exactly 6 months later, you had a man of Pakistani origin becoming the British Home Secretary. And we all know that okay, let me not get into that, that'll take me in a different direction. I'll begin my usual complaint and rant, so I'll kind of lose track of time. But, this particular manner of depriving someone of the access to what Gautam referred to as a bouquet of rights is very significant. Because what it opens up is a certain element of sadism on the part of the state, whereby the state is now demanding, show me your papers. The onus is on you. So it is this element of the sadistic in terms of citizenship, and I would call this nothing less than a tragedy, whereby the earlier capaciousness of citizenship has now been reduced to this tragic situation where a person stands stark naked in front of the might of the state and the state is telling him, show me your papers. Okay, if you don't show it to me, you're out. Now, this melee of sadism that I'm talking about is compounded by the relief of the people who do have the papers, the people who are privileged. the ones who have the access to, the powers of the state. So there's almost this kind of a sigh of relief, which people are kind of, heaving when they say, oh, I've got my papers intact. The point is that some of us may have the papers intact, there'll be many who will not. And therefore, what we have is what I call the sadism of citizenship, whereby individual citizens are partaking in the sadism that is being inflicted by the state on a set of vulnerable individuals, which I think is a travesty of justice itself. The most vulnerable being asked to prove the onus on them, the ones who do not have access. On that note, which is my second point, let me come to my third point, a point that Gautam again mentioned towards the end of his very interesting talk. This is the point about the response to the CAA. In your fourth chapter, that's a chapter that I read with a lot of interest. The most remarkable response to the CAA in the form of the women of Shaheen Bagh coming out in remarkable numbers. I mean, this was a phenomenon. The demonization and the vilification by the women of the women of Shaheen Bagh by the atrocious right-wing press, which the Supreme Court recently has been seized of the matter, talking about how hate is being spread by these channels. The Press Guild compared this to Radio Rwanda, Radio Miles Coles Libres, back in 1994, before the Rwandan genocide. And no, that's ominous in terms of what that indicates. But my point is, look at the response. The thing about politics, and the reason why I like observing politics so much as a political scientist, is that the political response will come from the most surprising of quarters. It'll hit you in such a way that you never realize, oh, it came from here. The very women, Muslim women, who were, people said were always confined to their houses, look at the way in which they came out and reclaimed the public sphere. I'm going to contrast that movement. It happened in 2019 at the end of the decade of the 2010s, which is such an awful decade. I mean, it's been such an awful 22 years of the 21st century. I hope this 21st century can redeem itself, because it's been a pretty bad 21st century. I'm sure it will. When I see people here packed in a room, listening intently to a book discussion, I mean, it reassures me as someone who's now getting very old, well, not very old, but middle-aged certainly, that, well, hope is not lost. There is always hope. Hope springs eternal, as we say. Now, let me come to this point. This is my third point, which I want to make, and I have to make it before Pankaj reminds me that my time is up. The decade of the 2010s was bracketed by two movements. One pretty atrocious, the Anna Hazare movement, the other one, the Shaheen Bagh movement. Very different kinds of movements. One was all about flag-waving patriotism, and I don't know how flag-waving would reduce corruption, but you better ask people like Anna Hazare and Arvind Kejriwal for that one. And this movement, not premised on flag-waving patriotism, but on constitutional patriotism. The ruling establishment hated it. Why? Because it's on that frenzied flag-waving patriotism that people have been asked to prove their loyalty, and to come back to the point that I made a little while ago, shows your papers. The onus being put on people. So my point about Shaheen Bagh was, in contrast to the frenzied flag-waving patriotism of the 2011 Anna movement, which I think led us to the mess that we are in right now. It was a movement, if you remember, Anupama, in those days, we'd have long discussions about it. I would always oppose it. It reminds me of Operation Car Wash in Brazil. On the 31st of October, they're going to have a second runoff. Hopefully, fingers crossed, Lula will win. This man called Jair Bolsonaro will be another one of those doddering dominoes who falls. I always talk about doddering dominoes. Began with Trump, Putin is doddering. The Islamic Republic of Iran is doddering, given the fact that women are now asserting the fact that they don't have to wear their hijab if they don't want to. And there's, the doddering domino that is Bolsonaro, which might mean that the 21st century is not lost after all. But let me come back to this point. The sobriety of the constitutional patriotism of Shaheen Bagh contrasted to the frenzied flag-waving patriotism of the Anna movement. What does it do? It represents not just a mere reclaiming of the public sphere, but a reconstitution of that very public sphere that was created by the Constitution. Never have I thought, in all the years that I've been around, which is quite a lot now, adding up, that the preamble of the Indian Constitution would become something so emotive that it would give someone like me, the goosebumps when I heard it being read out at Shaheen Bagh. I never thought that this would happen. What does that tell us? That tells us that constitutional patriotism, which people like Jürgen Habermas started talking about, the complaint about it was, oh, it's just too kind of dry as dust, it's not inspiring. But it was given flesh, bones, and spirit by the women of Shaheen Bagh, and I think this is significant. I keep mentioning this point, the women of Shaheen Bagh, because as someone who has a Muslim identity, I've been often reminded, oh, but where are the women? So when I remember when, in France 2005, when there were major riots there, some people from the French left after me. Where are the women in these protests? I said, give them a generation, you'll see many of them. And then, lo and behold, 15 years later. Now, this is what education can do. I taught at Jamia more than 15 years ago as a young lecturer. And what struck me in all these years is what public education can do. It can empower first generation people. The way that the young women of Jamia came out and argued eloquently, passionately, with, so convincingly against the CAA was remarkable. So my point that I'm trying to make here, in this third point of mine before I come to my fourth point, which I promise you will be my last one, is that what we are witnessing is not a mere reclaiming of the public sphere, but a reconstitution of the public sphere, which is significant. This is a point that Hannah Arendt makes in a book on the human condition, where she talks about a foray into the public sphere, which is not just about going into the public sphere and coming back, but about a kind of a life-transforming transformation. And this is the cusp of the moment that we are living right now. I don't mean to sound dramatic or apocalyptic. These are momentous times that we are living in. That old Chinese proverb, may you live in interesting times, well, we're perhaps living with that. But the reclaiming means that something big is happening in terms of people really realizing their rights. Pankaj mentioned my increasing interest in global politics, so I'll kind of do honor to that as well. I was a little disappointed in Chile, for example, when the Constituent Assembly had come up with a very progressive constitution, which was rejected by, I think, 64% of the electorate. I thought I was very disappointed by that. But anyway, we always kind of lose and then try again in politics. Lambi hai hum ki sham, magar sham hi to hai. That's what we often say. But yeah, the Chile is an interesting country. What were Chileans able to do? They were able to put forward a constitution that was entrenching socio-economic rights. It was called fiscally responsible and stuff like that the hard right always calls it, but there it was. So I'm trying to link what we are seeing in this country in terms of reclaiming the constitution as a larger constitutional movement across the world, whereby rights do not just remain paper presences in constitutions, but they mean more than that. Now I want to stress this point. The thing about rights is that quite often they have been known in terms of the fact that they have not been honored. When rights are not honored, they become ghosts. And when ghosts, and you know what ghosts do, they haunt the polity. That is exactly what the dishonoring of rights has done. They have haunted polities, and they will continue to haunt these polities for as long as those rights are not redeemed by the people whose lives are meant to be empowered by the exercising of those rights. So once again, in terms of rights, liberal rights, those critiques of liberal rights that we do when we talk about Marx and on the Jewish question, the problem with rights has always been in liberal theory, the fact that they've never translated into empowerment. I think the constitutional moment that we are living right now is one of those moments which will emphasize this particular aspect of rights becoming meaningfully transferred, not bourgeois rights that are mere paper presences, but actually can become more than that. And therefore, it's with great optimism that I looked at the Shaheen Bagh movement, and also the fact that I'm trying to kind of link the Shaheen Bagh movement with something which is happening halfway around the globe in a place like Chile, where, by the way, the Constituent Assembly consists of more than half the members of the Constituent Assembly were women, young people, members of indigenous communities. This is a significant moment, and I'm sure that this moment will bring about some change. Let me come to my last point, which is a point that Arudra mentioned towards the end of his talk. This is about the future. Now, every time I talk about concepts in political theory, I hope you can remember, I always talk about three aspects of the concept. One is the history behind a concept. The other is the power that is inside the concept. And the third is the normative future that a concept, kind of indicates, the desirable place that we should be in, the point that Arudra made, which I thought was a very powerful point. When it comes to the question of citizenship, I think what it is pointing towards is the kind of societies that we must fashion for ourselves. Because very unfortunately, the narrowing of constitution, of citizenship, has arisen along with the narrowing of the nation state. And as nation states have narrowed from a more capacious civic conception of nationalism to a much more narrow ethno-national conception of nationalism, they've really become meaner and meaner. Mr. Trump, for example, and his meanness of building a wall in the Mexican border, or Brexit, which I've been talking about a lot, perhaps to the point of obsession, and I can go on. But I think what nation states have done in terms of this narrowing of nationalism, Pope Francis, who I'm a great fan of, not that I'm a fan of many religious leaders, but when at the height of the pandemic talked about the narrow walls of nationalism, and I think this is exactly what is happening. The narrow walls of nationalism has made nations becoming meaner and meaner. How do they become mean? Well, they become mean by creating these boundaries. Boundaries, again, Gautam pointed this out on the Supreme Court's 2005 judgment of looking at migrants as threats of external aggression. So I'll end with the point that Pankaj made about the young 3-year-old Aylan Kurdi, 2015, 6-7 years ago, this young boy whose body was tragically found washed up on the Turkish shore, if I'm not wrong. His family was trying to cross into Europe. We'll see more of this. We will see more political refugees. We'll see more ecological refugees. The kind of narrowed down citizenship that nation states have been increasingly fashioning will just be washed away by this tidal wave of people looking for better lives. Because if citizenship is about anything, it is about the right to have a better life. I'll end on that note. Thank you very much.